Welcome, everyone. We're so happy you're here.
Primitive Reflexes, a quick crash course presented by us, Rachel and Jessica.
I'm Rachel.
Oh, I'm Jessica.
Yes. If you haven't listened to our podcast, if you haven't listened to other things, if you don't know us, then now you do. Okay, so we're both occupational therapy assistants. We've had experience in the past 7 years working in pediatric outpatient clinics. This has been kind of our setting where we've loved to work with kiddos of all ages and all diagnoses, even no diagnoses as well.
Yeah, and our goal is just to help these kids feel confident in their own skin and be successful, whatever that success looks for them, because success is different for everyone. Mm-hmm. So that's our goal. We want to teach parents, therapists, educators, everyone about sensory, about primitive reflexes, which is what we're going to talk about today.
Okay, before we go on to the next slide, in the little chat box or the Q&A box, whatever you want to do, go ahead and type in, if you're comfortable, who you are, if you are a parent, a therapist, an educator, an ABA, a paraprofessional. Just pop that in the Q&A box
or in the chat box. Do it in the chat.
Okay. Cool. OT from Illinois.
Parent, OT, parent.
School setting.
Oh, we got an optometrist, a vision therapist.
Oh, we've got some student OTs.
A PT, who's also a parent. Education officer. A couple of vision therapists. So cool.
Oh, you guys are amazing.
Lots of parents, lots of OTs.
Okay, Winnipeg. Oh my gosh. Dakota. Shout out to the Dakotas. Love it. Canada. Oh man. Canada. What? So
South Africa. Guatemala.
Oh, amazing. Oh, you guys are troopers because the time change is weird.
I love seeing people when they're from different countries.
Future parents. Yay. Oh. Love it. Okay, we've got a couple in our Q&A box as well.
Will it show you?
I think so. Oh, where's it allowing me to see the Q&A box? Oh no, if you put it in the Q&A box, then pop it into the chat. Yes.
I think we can't do the Q&A until we stop our screen share.
Yes.
So
okay.
We'll do that at the end.
Cool. Oh my gosh. So excited to have all of you here. Thank you. It's amazing.
Okay, so today we want you to learn what primitive reflexes are, why primitive reflex integration is so important for success for our kiddos. We want to teach you how to identify if a child may have retained primitive reflexes, and then we're going to show you what to do next.
I will say, because we have a lot of therapists in here as well, we didn't learn anything other than like the names of the reflexes and like what they do very minimally. We had to kind of memorize it for boards and stuff in school. So we learned very minimal in school, which is so frustrating. And then we got out into our jobs and we're like, okay, there are these things called primitive reflexes. We know a little bit about it. Same with sensory, to be honest. Mm-hmm. And okay, here you go. Let's start testing these reflexes and learning about it and seeing how they impact everyone. And it was like a complete, I don't know, I can't swear, but I'm just like, it was just like holy cow. Yeah. Oh my gosh, there's so many things out here that I have no idea about. So if you are in that situation, we had some students, we have some therapists as well. Like, just know that you're not alone if you are a new grad or if you're like in the field and you're like, what are these? Because
nobody teaches. You have to do continuing ed, things like what we're doing. That's why we're so passionate about it, because we think that everyone should know about primitive reflexes.
Yeah,
they're so important.
Okay, so let's talk about what the heck these primitive reflexes are and why they're important.
Okay, so we're all born with primitive reflexes, and at birth, these reflexes are present to assist in survival. Most reflexes develop in utero, and they are essentially involuntary movement patterns that help the infant, move in certain ways, get attention from the caregivers to help keep them alive and develop through infancy.
Help keep them alive. That's an interesting thought you bring up. It is. It helps them stay alive, which is crazy. Like, if there aren't these reflexes, or if they didn't have these reflexes, like, what would that look like? It could be really scary. Mm-hmm. So the trick here with these reflexes, the reason why they're called primitive reflexes, is because they should go away or mature or integrate. And so those words we'll kind of use interchangeably throughout this webinar, but just know that integrate means go away, mature, somewhere around the age of 12 months. Some reflexes are a little bit longer, a little farther, closer to like 2 to 3 years. It depends on the reflex and the unique situation of that child. So that's the trick. The reflexes need to integrate and go away or mature.
Yep. And the reason we don't say that they necessarily like disappear is because what happens is those primitive reflexes actually mature and integrate into more mature movement patterns so that higher level learning and motor skills can develop. So they don't just disappear into thin air, they actually like turn into more movement, mature movement patterns essentially.
Yes. And we'll kind of explain that a little bit more in depth too as we go into like the specific reflexes. So like Jessica mentioned, if these reflexes don't integrate when they should or on their own, then typical development can be hindered and the infant, the child, the adult might not be able to really obtain those higher level skills, which is never a good thing.
It's like their brain and their body get stuck and they can't move forward until that reflex integrates.
All right. So what happens if these reflexes don't integrate or mature or grow away? These we call retain. So that means that they're still holding on to those reflexes. And each of these reflexes that we're going to go over today comes with its own set of movements and leads to new and different developmental milestones. So if that specific reflex is retained, it might affect a certain area of development.
And then all of these reflexes relate to each other. It's all connected. So if one primitive reflex gets stuck or isn't integrated, then the one that comes next or that's connected to it might also get stuck and be retained.
Unfortunately, there's no like one size fits all, which makes our job interesting, but your job challenging if you're a parent too.
I will say, I don't think we put this in the slideshow, but most adults might have potentially retained primitive reflexes. And when you learn how to test for them, you might see some of it in yourself even. And I think the trick here is knowing when it impacts function, when it impacts your ability to get successfully through your day. That's when you really want to focus on integrating them.
Well, and it's just like sensory processing, like we talk about all the time. If your sensory system, if those challenges are negatively impacting your ability or your child's ability or your client's ability to get through their day with ease, that's when it's not any longer just a quirk, right? That's when it's like, okay, we have an issue. We need to address it. We need to intervene. So when it's really impacting your ability to get through the day, when you're noticing these things, that's when we should go, aha, let's figure out the underlying cause and work on it.
Okay, so we always want to ask why. Why are the primitive reflexes not integrating?
I know that one said what, but still, same idea.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so there's minimal research, unfortunately, that has been done as to why exactly these reflexes are retained. But there have been some factors that have been identified, and this is what we're sharing. Like we've said, this isn't a one size fits all. The first one, trauma during pregnancy. If you had trauma during your pregnancy, it doesn't necessarily mean that your child is going to have retained reflexes. But can it?
Maybe.
Yes.
Yeah, none of these are definitive. None of them are for sure. We're also not putting blame on anyone for anything. It's just something that can happen sometimes. And, these are factors that might have an impact on primitive reflex integration, but we're not saying they do for sure. So,
But also I think it's important as a therapist to at least know about these and ask these questions in your practice. So if you're chatting with someone that you're evaluating, identifying their history and really asking those questions of, okay, what happened during your pregnancy? How was your delivery? Let's talk about those details and really get to the bottom of it, because, the way that you approach it, it needs to be obviously kind and respectful, but at least you have an idea of what you're up against when you're helping this child. So if they do have these retained reflexes, you can look back and say, okay, it could be this reflex because of this that happened. So really looking at it from a whole child approach is really key. Like Jessica said, it's no one's fault, but when the more you know, what's the phrase? The more you know, the better. When you know, I don't know. You know what we're saying. This is helpful to just
The more you know.
know.
It's just the more you know.
Yeah.
And then even
The more
as,
you know.
yeah.
The more you know, the more you know.
Even as parents, if you recognize any of these that you went through as a parent, you can say, oh, okay, maybe my child is at a higher risk of having retained primitive reflexes. So we know what the next step is if that's the case.
Yes.
The more you know.
The more you know, the more you know.
Okay. So you can see them here. You can see these ones here.
Yeah.
I think the last one on this list, the minimal floor time as an infant, that is something, if you've been with Rachel and I for any length of time, you know that we are very pro putting your infant on the floor and using containers as little as possible. And the reason is because those containers do prevent natural movement and free movement of the baby. And as we get going into this, we're going to talk more about how movement is essential to primitive reflex integration.
But just know, coming from two moms who are also therapists, we understand that it's life, and sometimes you need a place to put your baby. Maybe they have reflux, maybe, you know, you have other kids or animals and it's not safe to necessarily always put them on the floor. But just knowing that and being mindful of, you know, having a child in a car seat for an hour every day, or going, you know, to appointments every day, and then coming home and putting them in a bouncer or an exerciser, and then putting them in their high chair. Just know, like, keep in mind the length of time that you're using these containers, and just less is more. Everything in moderation, right? It's just like chocolate. I don't like that. But anyways, some people say chocolate in moderation, not me though.
I think you guys understand what we're talking about. So let's keep going.
Also, if you do have questions that come up during this webinar, and if you are viewing live, then you can pop them in that Q&A box and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. If you're watching the recording of this later on, then you can shoot us an email or a DM on Instagram with your questions.
Okay, so like we already said, this list is not exhaustive. It's also not definitive. They are potential factors.
The more you know, the more you know.
The more, yeah, I know exactly what it says. Somebody put in the comments or the Q&A what exactly that saying is, so that we know.
Yeah, that'd be great.
We know what it is. It's there. Okay, so we're going to talk about 6 primitive reflexes that we as CODAs often saw in our treatment with our clients. And these would be the 6 that we would focus on the most. There are a lot more, but these are the ones we focus on.
Yeah. What was fun too is, you know, I saw these in Trip because it was very much on my mind when he was developing and when he was young. And it's just something I constantly think about.
Yeah.
So the Moro reflex, I feel like this is one of the most well-known and the most common and the most familiar with. And so this is the one that's definitely present at birth. It's an involuntary movement in response to sudden stimuli.
So it's also known as the startle reflex. So for example, if you're holding your infant and you set them down, or you like do the pretend drop, then they're gonna, you know what I'm talking about. They're gonna have that startle. Their arms are gonna come out. They're gonna clench like this. They're probably gonna cry or make a noise afterwards. That is the Moro reflex, and it is normal.
It's normal. It should happen. It keeps them safe. I will say that I have heard some rumors going around on good old social media that I would love to address just very briefly, that swaddling is now causing, or they're saying that swaddling causes the Moro reflex to not integrate. And there's definitely nothing wrong with swaddling your baby. There's, you know, a couple of things to note, like obviously don't do it all the time, you know, free movement, like we're saying, let them have free movement and wiggle their arms and their legs. And then don't do it when they're starting to show signs of rolling. So when they're lifting their feet up and touching their, and, you know, rolling side to side with their feet up, you know, just be cautious with it. But I haven't found research. I haven't seen anything come through that says that we should not be swaddling our babies. If your baby doesn't like to be swaddled, that's okay. If they do, that's okay. It's good proprioceptive input. So just a couple of things to keep in mind.
Side note. So important to note that the Moro reflex should be integrated, no longer present, by about 6 months after birth. And because all primitive reflexes are related, this is related to the integration of a couple of the other reflexes as well. But 6 months is kind of that mark of like, okay, at 6 months, we want to see that motor reflex integrated.
So as the child grows, typically we'll see these symptoms later on if they still have that retained motor reflex. So again, this is not an exhaustive list. Like we set up here, it's not a symptom checklist. It's just for your information.
Potential. We have to just disclaimer all of these things. Potentially. Yes. Potential.
Yes. So motion sickness, decreased eye contacts, like sensory processing challenges, specifically like sensitivities, allergies, a weak immune system. Anxiety is a big one that we see with this one. And then challenges with sports involving hand-eye coordination as well.
So I think the important thing here, especially like if you're a parent, if you notice that your child falls into any of these items, it could just be like a thing like, I wonder if maybe their moro is retained.
But if there's like 4 or 5 that you're like, oh my gosh, yes, they get motion sickness, they're super sensitive to sound, they have a terrible immune system, they're always sick, they have allergies, they have anxiety. Like if there's multiple things, then it's more likely that they might have that retained motor reflex. Disclaimer.
All over the place.
Yeah.
Okay, the next one, we call it the TLR. It's the tonic labyrinthine reflex. And this is you can see in the little picture here.
That's actually true.
It's the airplane when your infant does that little airplane movement.
Well, I mean, see, and this is where it gets confusing because like the actual airplane, like as that kind of works itself, like that's the Landau reflex, but it's all connected to the tonic labyrinthine reflex as well. So it's all connected. But yes, it's very well linked to the motor reflex. And is seen with the movement of the head forwards or backwards, providing a method of response to gravity. So it helps them identify where their body is at in space. Okay, this is gravity. What is this? This is strange.
Yep.
How do I work with it?
Yep. So it has to do with all those head movements as a baby is learning how to move on their own. Now, the TLR develops in utero, and it does have a direct influence on muscle tone. So that's an important note as well. And then it should be integrated by as late as 3 years. So when we're looking at these kiddos, if we have a 3-year-old who has a retained TLR, that, doesn't typically fall into like big red flag. But it can also be integrated as early as 6 months, depending on the child.
Yes. So this is why tummy time is so important. This is why head lag is so important to be aware of, like when you're pulling your infant to sit from their shoulders and does that make sense?
No, because you're holding their arms.
Well, I mean, you shouldn't like hold their arms, but like behind their shoulders.
So like here. We need a video.
So if I'm like pulling her up to sit from like behind her shoulders, I mean, you can use their arms, but it's just like, be careful with that. So if you're pulling them up and their head is just like, and it's lagging behind instead of like staying in line with their trunk, then, that's a red flag, right? So that's why you want to be aware of those activities and you're practicing those activities, little baby sit-ups and tummy time. Do your tummy time.
All about the tummy time. All right, some symptoms of a potentially retained TLR are going to be challenges with crawling, poor posture, and low muscle tone. So that's like the kiddos that we see that are floppy. Vision challenges, auditory processing challenges, poor sense of space, time, and organization, and then challenges with sports.
So we're not going to go into like why all of these are symptoms, but just from the research that we've done, from the research that is out there, this is a list of potential symptoms that can arise from that retained TLR.
Okay, number 3, the palmar grasp reflex. This is an involuntary response to stimuli on the palm of the hand. And so if you think about an infant who has like that death grip on your hair or the death grip on your finger, that is actually the palmar grasp reflex.
So this reflex develops typically around 11 to 16 weeks in utero, which is crazy. They already have these reflexes when they're just growing in your belly, right?
They're just like
I know, it's so cool. So this reflex should be integrated or not present by no later than 6 months of age. So that's when the child begins to grasp and release objects and they're working on that intentional grasp.
Yeah, because if you think about that palmar grasp reflex, if they get input to the palm of their hand, they reflexively clench their fist. But by about 6 months of age, they should be intentionally reaching and holding and transferring objects. And so that reflex should be gone by that point so that they can release.
Our squirrel friend is back.
So we don't want to eat
squirrels. Okay, so some of these symptoms of the retained palmar grasp reflex: delayed fine motor skills, which obviously makes sense if they are not able to intentionally grasp and release objects; challenges with handwriting as they get older; challenges with things like self-care, brushing their teeth, buttoning their clothes, doing zippers, tying their shoes; tactile hypersensitivity, so like sensitive to different textures on their hands, maybe they don't like to get messy. And then this is a cool one, is potential challenges with speech, because our hands and our mouths with these reflexes are directly connected as well, which is so crazy.
If you have seen an infant eat, like
like, yes, we've all seen infants,
like sucking on a bottle or a nipple, doing that sucking. If you watch their hands are also going to be moving. And so there's that connection between the mouth and the hands that you can actually see in infancy. But once that palmar grasp reflex is integrated, that connection isn't as strong anymore. Shouldn't be as strong.
Yeah.
So many things.
I know. Okay. Oh, here's little Trip Man again.
He's just the perfect model.
I know. See what I mean? Where it's like, that's all I thought about. I was like, oh, there's his ATNR. So the ATNR is the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. And this has been associated with assisting during the birthing process, as well as facilitates kicks while the baby is in utero. So when you're feeling the baby kick in your belly, it's like, pa, pa, right? And it's like the dabs. Yes, that's what I think of. So movement of the head to one side is movement of the head to one side causes movement of the arms and legs to the other side.
This is also known as the fencer position, which you can see in our picture is Trip in his fencing dabbing position. Yeah, I think it's just really cool to think about how this reflex can help in the birthing process, the natural birthing process. So if we go back to earlier when we were talking about potential causes of retained primitive reflex, you think about a C-section and how the ATNR isn't stimulated during the birth if the child is born via C-section, and that is why it could be a potential red flag.
Yeah, and oftentimes these reflexes are designed to like start the integration process during birth. So if there are all of these interventions during birth and the child can't work through these reflexes and the beginning stages of integrating these reflexes, no one tells you that, right, as a new mom. So you're not going to be aware to know what to look for and how to help facilitate the integration of these reflexes.
And again, we are not shaming anyone for anything that's happened during your birth. We are just saying that it is something to keep in mind.
The more you know, the more you know.
Okay,
has anyone told us what that phrase is yet?
I'm gonna interrupt right.
Yeah.
Knowledge is power.
Yeah.
Okay, we can look later.
Cool.
Okay. So the ATNR develops at around 18 weeks in utero, and then it should be integrated by no later than 9 months of age. And if you just think about typical development in infants, this is around the time that child should be crawling. If you think about that ATNR, when head movement affects limb movement, if they're crawling, they're going around crawling and they turn their head and all of a sudden they can't crawl anymore.
It's all connected. Okay. I will say before we go on to the symptoms, like if your child doesn't crawl in like a typical pattern, if they are scooting, Trip had a janky crawl at first, so he would crawl with one leg kind of like in a more flexion type position. Those are things that we want to correct, and we want them to get that input to their arms and legs and their knees equally and properly, because it really does impact development, even though some people will say that it doesn't. It does.
We believe it.
Yes.
Our opinion. All right. Some symptoms of a potentially retained ATNR is going to be challenges with crawling, like we just talked about. Challenges with handwriting. If you think about, that effect of, I'm getting really into detail here because it's just,
we need the visual.
You think about that head movement. If somebody is writing and they turn their head and their arms, they don't have control of their arms.
Clearly it's not this it's not that dramatic.
It's not,
but you get the idea.
It is going to have an effect.
Because if you're looking from the board, especially depending on where the kiddo is positioned in the classroom, but if they're looking from the board and they're having those like extraneous movements from when they're rotating their head in different positions, it's going to make handwriting and paying attention a heck of a lot harder in the class.
Just the same with, visual tracking. So being able to coordinate both of your eyes and smoothly visually track objects in their environment, it's going to affect hand dominance, their ability to identify left versus right.
Yes.
And then age appropriate gross motor skills like skipping, riding a bike, all of those gross motor skills that involve both sides of the body.
Yes.
Okay, number 5.
So this is the symmetrical tonic neck reflex. So a little bit different than the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, but this one is directly related to the TLR, the tonic labyrinthine reflex, because the STNR assists the infant in moving from prone, so laying on their tummy, to getting onto all fours or in their quad position. So it's like a pre-crawling position where they're like sit and like rock on all fours. And it assists with integrating that TLR. So like we said, if one doesn't progress through that natural great development, then the others might not progress as well.
I think the most interesting thing about the STNR is that it doesn't develop in utero. It develops between 6 to 9 months after birth as that TLR is integrating.
Some people say this isn't a true primitive reflex because it's not present at birth or in utero,
and it has such a short lifespan.
Yes, but you'll see with some of the symptoms, like it definitely falls into the primitive reflex category, even if it's not like technically labeled as that.
We like to address it just because of the huge impact that it does have on development, even though it is such a short-lived reflex, but it's also so directly related to the TLR that it's like, yes, we need to address it.
Yes, definitely.
So it develops between 6 to 9 months after birth, and then it should be integrated by 9 to 11 months of age. So, by a year.
So what that means by develop, so you should see it, right? We want to see the STNR around 6 to 9 months. We'll say around 6 months. We'll want to see the baby getting on all fours, starting to rock, but it should go away. It should integrate by 9 to 11 months. We'll say 6 to 11 months is like the kind of lifespan of it.
I would say by the time the infant is pulling into standing and starting to cruise along furniture.
Yes, yep.
Is when we want to see it integrated.
Definitely. Okay, so the symptoms, like we mentioned, this is why it definitely falls into that primitive reflex category. Challenges with crawling. Sometimes a baby won't crawl typically or in that good quad position because of the STNR impacting that. We'll also see poor posture. So we'll see like the slumped posture, low muscle tone, again, connected to the TLR. Crazy. W sitting. So if you don't know what W sitting is, it's where your legs, do you want to demonstrate this?
No.
Where if you're looking down on the child while they're sitting, their legs are like in a W and their feet are going out.
Yeah, the trick here is that it's not, we had one of our good friends talk to us about this, and she said, well, what about like the position that you get into in like yoga, like almost like that child's pose, and your legs can be out, kind of splayed out a little bit. And we said, no, this is like when a child is sitting on the floor playing and their legs are out and their feet are also pointed out. Their feet aren't tucked in, their feet are out. That's like the big sign of the W sit.
Really trying to get a wide base of support to add like postural control to their body and more stability. So a couple more: clumsiness, poor attention, and then challenges potentially with reading and writing as well.
Yeah.
Like we said kind of earlier, if these reflexes don't integrate or go away, they're not going to be, these kids aren't going to be able to progress into these higher level abilities, reading and writing, right? So if these reflexes are impacting those, I mean, it's just something to keep in mind as you are assessing the child or looking at these differences.
Okay, number 6, the last one we're going to talk about is the spinal galant reflex, and it is also associated with the birthing process along with the ATNR. So in infants, stimuli or input provided to the lower back or along the spine will produce movement of the spine and the trunk and the hips. Yeah,
so if you think about like tickling an infant, like swiping your finger down their back, like there's a response, right? And
Mhm.
so we want to keep that in mind to help, as the infant is like corkscrewing out of the birth canal. That's kind of the first integration process, similar to the ATNR of, okay, we're going to work our way out of the birth canal to help work on integration. But this reflex, it develops in utero around 20 weeks, when the baby is around 20 weeks, preparing for the birthing process.
And then it should be integrated or no longer present by around 6 months of age.
Mm-hmm.
So some symptoms of a potentially retained spinal galant reflex. Should we start calling it the SGR?
Yeah, it's a mouthful.
Side note. Okay, so challenges with developmental milestones such as rolling, challenges with, this is supposed to say gait, not gain.
Oh,
sorry for the
great.
typo.
Good
Challenges
catch.
with natural gait. This can potentially have an effect on scoliosis.
Mm-hmm.
Challenges with focus, attention, sitting still, all of those things that we see in kiddos with ADHD. Bedwetting beyond the ages of 5 or 6 when the child is toilet trained. And then tactile hypersensitivity, specifically with clothing. Now, this plays into those ADHD symptoms, because if you have a child with a retained spinal galant reflex and they're sitting at their desk and their shirt or the back of their chair is constantly giving them input to their spine, they're not going to be able to sit still because they're having that associated movement.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore they're going to have poor attention, poor focus. They're not going to be able to sit still, and they're labeled as ADHD.
It's almost as if they have like ants in their pants. Like that's one way that this reflex is described, is like they're just like wiggling and they can't sit still. And maybe the feeling like when you've been sitting too long, it's kind of that similar thought.
Yeah. And then the bedwetting, we get a lot of questions about that. We didn't have it in the last slide, but we probably should, that it also can elicit urination when stimuli is provided to the lower back in infancy. And so an older child with this reflex still retained, they're sleeping and they turn and twist and turn and they get that input to their back and it causes them to urinate. So what do you do next? Like we said at the beginning, we're not going to teach specific testing. We're not going to teach specific exercises just because this is a free webinar and we have a ton of resources that can help with that. So that's what we want to tell you about next.
Yes. So the first thing, seek out an occupational therapist or an occupational therapy assistant.
Or a physical therapist. We do know that there are a lot of physical therapists who work with retained primitive reflexes.
Yes, thank you. And they can help test your child's primitive reflexes and they can help guide you on that path of integration. I've also heard chiropractors do too.
Oh, yeah.
So that's another option to look for maybe in your area.
Yeah. Lots of crawling and climbing. You saw in all those symptoms that many of our reflexes have an impact on crawling. So we want to get activities that coordinate the arms and the legs, both sides of the body, get some visual input in there, crawling through tunnels, climbing over playground equipment. If your child is hesitant, see if you can get creative on ways to help them make it fun.
And this doesn't necessarily have to be just infants. Like when we say crawling and climbing activities, this is kids of all ages. They should be crawling, even adults. Like when's the last time you as an adult have gotten down on the floor and crawled? Like it's a good workout.
Wear some knee pads if you really need it. I was just thinking on the hard floor. I was like, man, that's not money. But yeah, no, infants, obviously we want them to be doing a lot of crawling. We don't want to skip crawling, but for those older kids with these retained reflexes, they also need to do it as well.
Yes. Okay, obstacle courses. We love obstacle courses. If you're familiar with our OT, then you might already be familiar with these obstacle courses, but they're great opportunities to provide movement, incorporate those bilateral integration skills, crawling and climbing like we love. And they don't have to be like Ninja Warrior type obstacle courses.
They can be.
I mean, exactly. They can be whatever you want, but it's just like incorporating 3 steps, crawling, jumping, gathering an item, wheelbarrow walking back to it, you know what I mean? But just like that repetitive 3-step sequence going through, getting those different movements.
And then,
I love the star.
We do have a primitive reflex digital course where we teach you how to test for primitive reflexes, and then we teach you specific exercises. We also give you activities to incorporate throughout the day in your child's play routine that can also help. So
yeah, and I think the coolest thing with that one is we do teach the functional activities, because so often it's like we've got these exercises, kids who are in OT or kids in general don't necessarily want to just sit down and do these exercises. They would rather, which, that's not their occupation. Their occupation is play. So if we can build these activities that will help integrate their reflexes into play, then it's going to have the most prolonged benefit for these kiddos.
Okay. Of course you're ready to take the next step. That's why you're here. So we want to give you a little discount for joining us today. You are going to get all of this emailed to you. So I mean, you're not going to click on our email, but when you get the email, if you want to purchase our digital course, you can use this code to get 25% off your purchase. And then we want to give you some freebies.
Yes, so we created these freebies, these handouts to help guide you in your journey with primitive reflexes. The first one is kind of an integration timeline. We do recommend laminating these and sticking them on your fridge for a good reminder, but that way you can kind of keep along, like if you do have a new baby, or if you're going to have a new baby, or if you are a therapist working in early intervention with new babies, you can kind of see that visual on the integration timeline of, okay, let's keep in mind, like, when should these be integrated? What should we be doing? How should we be working on these?
Yes. And then our primitive reflex 411 is really just the general information that we went over here, just in a downloadable, printable form. This is great for, therapists to give to your families that you're working with. The same thing with the potential causes for retained primitive reflexes. It's just great information to have.
Really helpful, not super overwhelming. We try to word it in like simple terminology so that everyone can understand it.
Okay.
Cool.
You made it to the end.
Yes. So just a quick crash course. Like we said, we were just touching on the basics, but we do want to offer an opportunity for you to send us your questions. We do have some in the Q&A box now that we will get to, but if you have things come up, go ahead and pop them in there and we will address those. And we're going to keep the recording on because I feel like if you're watching the recording of this webinar, you'll probably have similar questions. And so I feel like that will be helpful for everyone. But some of them, I'm assuming we won't be able to answer just because of the nature of them.
We're going to try.
Yes.
We do. You can see some links on here really quick. We do have like an entire blog series on all of these reflexes. It's really great. And then, of course, our podcast. We have a podcast on every single one of these primitive reflexes.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do some Q&A.
Stop our share.
Okay, we're going to answer questions for 15 minutes?
Yes.
Okay, we're going to do as best we can to get to as many of these as we can, and we're going to talk as well as we can.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so we're in the Q&A box first. Are we starting at the top?
Yes, and I do see some here. We've got our chat too. Can you put the code back up? The code will be emailed to you.
Yep.
Yes, so you will have it.
You are going to get a copy of this recording. You are going to get a copy of the slideshow as well, plus links to all the downloads.
The more you know, the more you know.
If you know, you know.
Yes. Okay, so we will start here in the Q&A box. Okay, great questions, you guys.
Go back all the way up to the top.
Okay.
You went so fast.
Oh, well, these were people who put in their information here when they were first joining.
Great.
So we'll start with, is this something that could be worked on and improved, integrated as even as an adult?
Yes.
I will say from what I've found that, let's say I feel like my TLR reflex isn't the most integrated it could be. And it's almost something like our morning coffee, right? Like we have to do these exercises every morning in order to feel our best and perform our best. For some cases, especially in adulthood. But for kiddos, I think it's really important to go through an integration plan and then reassess and see where we're at, see if the biggest challenges have been improved. And then you can kind of go from there. Some kiddos, maybe they need to do them every day, once a day. Maybe they need to be on more of a, what's the word? Just as needed. So you're doing these exercises, maybe if they get sick or if they have an injury and they need to kind of do these reflex integration exercises every day to just kind of get back on track. Do you know the word that I was thinking
I
of?
don't.
Okay.
I think for adults, you just have to determine if it's impacting your ability to get through your day. And if it is, then yeah, you need to do the exercises.
Yes.
Do we know why a cesarean section, even a planned cesarean section? So in the slideshow, we did talk about how a couple of the primitive reflexes are thought to help and assist with the birthing process. And so if you think about an infant who was born via C-section, they're not getting that same movement and that same input as they would if they're going through the birth canal. So
like we said, it kind of starts the integration process, whereas it's not always yes. If you have a C-section, your child's going to have retained reflexes.
It's not a definitive.
It's just something to keep in mind. Like, oh, I had a C-section. Oh, I wonder if maybe my kiddo's spinal gallant isn't integrated. Let's look into it. So it's more of like, oh, okay, this is something to be aware of. That we wish that people would. That we wish like more professionals would tell families who are going through these traumatic experiences. And
yeah.
They're obviously there for a reason, and they save lives, and there's a whole lot of different opinions that we won't go into on that right now.
So would an adult make the same startle reflex to allow noise if the Moro is not integrated? Does that mean that their hands are coming up as well? Probably not. If we're thinking about an adult with a retained Moro, we might see a lot of anxiety and easily overstimulated by a variety of inputs, maybe auditory or visual or tactile. Anxiety is going to be the big one with that Moro reflex. The motion sickness. But like that actual physical response might not be as prevalent.
But also know that Moro reflex does like morph or mature into a more mature like startle response, because we all get scared, we all get startled, like that's normal, but we're not having those bigger reactions. We're not constantly anxious about everything in our environment, in that like fight or flight.
Yes.
It's a good way of explaining it.
Yes.
Okay. If a child integrates a reflex later than typical, what does that mean? Or just be happy that it eventually integrated?
Just be happy that it eventually integrated.
Yes. Yeah. And it could mean that some other things are delayed or potentially delayed as well. Like, with other reflexes that could be delayed. So I think looking at it from the whole picture of, maybe if it was their TLR that integrated later, do we need to look at their muscle tone? Do we need to kind of work on that, or some reading and writing skills? So I would say be very happy, but also like, don't stop looking and see if there are any other things that need to be addressed.
I think it's also important to remember that every person is so different, and every person is going to develop a little bit differently than the person next to them. And that's okay, as long as we can help to make that child as successful as they can be. And again, success looks different for everyone. So.
Okay, my little man was born with torticollis, so is mine. Would this have an effect on, I'm assuming the TLR is what we meant there. Obviously, yes, it can impact everything.
His torticollis is going to restrict movement.
Going to restrict just going through those normal movement patterns. They might be later to develop rolling, crawling. I feel like that's why Tripp's crawl was a little janky at first, was because he was tighter on one side. So yes, it can definitely affect it. And that's why we like to say, address it young and continue to monitor it. So make sure that it's not impacting them as they grow up as well.
Another question about the C-section. Again, there's no definitive answer, yes or no, if your child is born C-section, that the reflexes will be retained. It's just a possibility.
Yeah.
Thank you for the webinar. You're welcome. Parent of a 15-month-old. Does the course have integration techniques for a child that young who doesn't like to be held? What are your thoughts?
Well,
because you also have a 15-month-old.
Yes, I would say the activities are designed for older kiddos.
Probably 3 and up.
But the activities are still beneficial to know about and to build into play. So, building like a crawling activity into a certain activity that you're doing with your kiddo would be helpful for these reflexes. But learning more about like the underlying information rather than just, okay, these are the integration activities, but kind of learning about the whole situation instead. But no, we're not focusing on the activities for the infant. We are working on a course.
Yeah, I think for that age, under 3, I think that if you have specific concerns about like a child who doesn't like to be held or touched, talk to your pediatrician about getting an OT eval for early intervention, and then focus on those developmental movement activities. But just because at younger age, they're still developing, and that in-person OT, like we love our course. We're partial to our course. Of course we are. But honestly, nothing can replace in-person OT.
But also do your research and find a therapist who does specialize in sensory integration and reflex integration as well.
For that age. Yes, because it is different than with older kids. Okay, so this is the second time we've seen a question about RPR. I'm
assuming TLR because the R is right next to the T.
Okay. Should any OT have the skills around? No, kind of like what we talked about in the beginning. We went through school and we've talked to many other therapists who also went to school. I mean, obviously they went to school. And there's very little covered in the way of primitive reflexes. It's all learned on the job and through continuing ed.
Okay. What does an integrated motor reflex look like?
I missed that.
Like what takes over? So it's more of like a mature startle pattern. So let's say like I jump out and scare Jessica, right? Some auditory input that she wasn't expecting.
And visual.
And, she's going to jump, right? And then be able to move on, right? And so that's like the physical response, but it's definitely just being out of that fight or flight response, because infancy, babies are trying to survive and they're just in that constant fight or flight, and they're very aware of their surroundings when that novel sensory stimuli is provided. So it's definitely more of like underlying responses, I guess you could say.
It's all of those chemicals that are produced during that fight or flight. And if those chemicals are produced constantly, that's where you see that anxiety and that decreased immune system response, because those chemicals are just constantly flowing and they shouldn't be constantly flowing, right? So integrated moral as, for an adult or a child who hasn't integrated, they might get startled, but they can calm, and they are calm the majority of the time.
Okay, this question looks like it's from a therapist and using certain phrases to educate parents on the importance of reflex integration in a way that they can understand.
Send them this webinar.
Send them the webinar. Honestly, give them the handouts and just explain to them about the underlying challenges affecting future developmental skills, and almost explain to them like their child could be in like a fight or flight, and we want to get them out of that fight or flight, those immature movement patterns. We want to get them out of those immature movement patterns that they're stuck in into more mature integrated responses and movements.
Yeah, it's tricky.
It is, yeah.
I think oftentimes, as a therapist, we have such limited time with our parents that sending them outside resources might be your best bet for helping them understand, or bringing them into the session if that's a possibility.
We do have a podcast coming that we talk about it a little bit more in depth as well with another OT. So keep your eyes peeled for that one. Ears, I guess it's a podcast. Keep your ears peeled.
What are some qualities I should be looking for in a good OT or OT facility? I think, oh my gosh, I could name so many. First of all, you need to feel comfortable with the therapist you're working with. If you don't feel like they're addressing your concerns, that could be a red flag. Like if they're just, no offense to any OTs, I'm not trying to bring offense to anyone, but if your therapist is just going about their session and kind of brushing off your concerns, and they're just like, nope, we have these goals, so that's what we're going to work on, but they're not listening to what you're having to say, that could be something that you'd be like, you might need someone else.
I would say they should be building rapport with you and with your child. They should be honest with you as well, and upfront and open. Like Jessica mentioned, they should be addressing your concerns, but I think that you'll just feel that trust and that connection. And if you don't feel that, find someone else, and don't be afraid to say, I'm not feeling it. We're going to try something different.
Yep. Go with your gut. Are there standardized assessments for assessing primitive reflexes?
I haven't found any standardized assessments.
Not in the sense of standardized like the Peabody or the BOT.
Yes, but we do share some handouts and some tools for assessing them that are not standardized. We do share those in our course that are not standardized, but guidelines.
They're guidelines, and they're also what we test, what we show you how to test in the course is what is typically done for testing reflexes across the country.
Yep.
Assuming world.
Yeah.
All right, you guys, we're getting really close. We only got a couple more though, because we're almost at an hour.
Oh, can your reflexes backslide, for example, after a concussion?
Yes.
Any trauma? Yes.
Especially 100%. A TBI, a traumatic brain injury, or trauma, you know, physically can definitely reverse, I mean, everything. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. What factors do you take into consideration, including primitive reflexes with delayed crawlers? I would say, like the person mentioned, torticollis is a good one to keep in mind. Torticollis, tongue ties, lip ties, that tightness, the primitive reflex integration.
I would look at muscle tone. Do they have good muscle tone, or are they low muscle tone? Other diagnoses like CP, which plays into that muscle tone, or a genetic
podcast about this.
A genetic
this is a good question. I like this one.
For delayed crawlers.
Do adults go to see OTs for these things? Oh, I wish.
Maybe we should start that.
Yeah, I feel like in the hospital setting, like if someone does have a TBI or a brain injury of some sort of traumatic experience, then potentially they could be addressed in like the hospital setting. But I haven't found like an outpatient clinic, maybe a chiropractor office. I don't know. I haven't found anything.
So thank you to this person for telling us what RPR, retained primitive reflex. You're just abbreviating it. So smart. See, that's why I wanted to abbreviate the spinal gallant to SGR.
We haven't heard that one.
That is great.
So good.
The left torticollis. What would it look
like? Okay. So if they were still struggling, I would just look for asymmetries. If they have retained, or if they have like a torticollis, I would look for asymmetries, maybe delayed walking, pulling to stand, again, with like the tightness and the muscle tone as well, because it might be impacting those reflexes from integrating on their own.
Have you seen diagnoses such as ASD or ADHD been reversed after primitive reflexes have been integrated?
Steep slope.
So personally, I have not. I will say this isn't related to primitive reflexes, but we have heard a couple of stories of kiddos who have had vision therapy, kudos to vision therapy, who had symptoms of ADHD and they were getting ready to get diagnosed with ADHD. They completed vision therapy and they no longer had symptoms of ADHD. I know that's not related, but it is. I feel like that is a great example of what could happen.
Yes.
Potentially. I don't think about it for autism. I think that one would be like a harder one because there's more involved in autism than primitive reflexes. But maybe ADHD, if the ADHD symptoms are coming from like the spinal gallant, you know,
as well as sensory processing challenges too, if those are addressed as well.
Which, if you think about it, it's all related, because if you have a retained spinal gallant, you're going to have sensory processing challenges because you're going to be tactily defensive.
Oh, thanks for laughing at us.
I know. I'm like,
retained primitive reflexes, RPR. Good to know.
The more, if you know, you know.
Yeah.
Oh, you always share our podcast. Oh, thank you so much. That's why we do it. Yes, reflexes can backslide after a TBI. Oh, okay. Weird. Okay.
How many more do we have? Couple more. Okay, let's do like 3 more, maybe 3 or 4 more.
If we don't answer your question, send us a message on Instagram.
Yes.
Okay. Is it the retained reflex that causes poor muscle tone, or poor muscle tone that causes retained reflex? I would say it could go either way. And my first thought is a child with cerebral palsy. And that is not something that is something that happens in utero, right?
During birth,
right?
After birth.
So if your child is born and they have low muscle tone at birth and they have a diagnosis or they don't have a diagnosis, then that low muscle tone could potentially impact primitive reflex integration. Vice versa, if your child is born and at birth maybe their muscle tone seems fairly normal, but for some reason their primitive reflexes don't start integrating as they age, then that could have an impact on their muscle tone.
I will say I did talk to my pediatrician because I felt like Trip had low muscle tone as well. And he was a little bit floppier when he was born. And I mean, knowing all of his history and what he had, and I had a natural vaginal birth. It was great. I was like, I did it all right. I hate saying that.
Right. You didn't do it. Nothing.
No, but it's like, it goes to show that, you know, it's not just one factor. It's a tongue tie, it's a lip tie, it's torticollis, it's position in utero. It's all of these underlying things that can potentially impact. So there's no right or wrong. There's no, well, I mean, there kind of is what came first, chicken or the egg. I like that question.
Came first?
Yes.
What came first?
Yes.
It's all connected.
We do have a podcast episode on interoception.
I know. I'm looking to see what number. Number 19.
It was an early one. Okay.
If they skip crawling, they probably will have retained primitive reflexes. I say probably because it's not for sure, but probably.
Yes. I would look at the underlying reason as to why they skipped crawling, because most likely there is a reason.
Yep. Last one.
Okay.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Yes. Okay. Can I trigger my own reflex like tickling, or does it have to be done by someone else?
Well, can you tickle yourself? Can you tickle yourself?
No.
So my understanding is that tickling is actually a pain response.
Oh, that's an interesting thought.
I read something somewhere that says when you get tickled, it's actually a pain response, but your body has to like, your brain has to like turn it around to make you laugh instead of cry.
Okay. Okay. Good to know.
I don't know. That's a good question. I just don't know.
Yes.
If we didn't, we're at an hour, you guys. Thank you for being here. You stuck through the whole thing. If we didn't answer your question, please send us a message on Instagram, All Things Sensory Podcast.
Yes, and we can get to more questions there. We just want to keep this webinar to an hour for all of our friends who are watching the recording. If you're live, thank you for being here live. We appreciate it. It's been so fun. Hopefully this kind of just, you know, tickled your imagination on reflexes, because it's so fun to chat about it.
If you took a picture or a video during this, share it on Instagram.
Oh yeah, here, take a picture. Jeez. Just kidding.
All right, if you know, you know.
Yes. Thanks everyone. Thank you for all your kind words. We appreciate it.
We're really glad you were here.